All right, what is going on, you guys? Brian here, and this is my AEW Dynamite recap for this week's episode. Of course, this was night number 1 of AEW's Bash at the Beach. Of course, next week is going to be taking place uh, on the Jericho Cruise, so that'll be interesting to see what happens on that episode next week. But let's get right into this week's episode. Before I begin, my condolences go out to the family of Rocky Johnson, who passed away today at the age of 75, a Hall of Famer, a former tag team champion. Of course, he is the father of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, so my thoughts and prayers are with his family at this time. Um, some news concerning AEW. Apparently, they got renewed for a couple of more years. And a part of that new deal, apparently they're going to be receiving a second show, which might be having to do with AEW Dark being removed from YouTube and moved to one of the TV stations. I believe either probably TNT or TBS or some of like Time Warner company owns. So that should be interesting to see how that develops and when that exactly happens. Of course, AEW Dark airs on YouTube every Tuesday, so that'll be interesting to see how they progress with uh, that whole bit of business. But getting into this week's episode of Dynamite, it featured a lot of questions. 2 questions in general. What would Cody's response be to MJF's stipulations for a match between Cody and MJF at Revolution? Would he accept? And of course, the other question is, or was going into tonight, what kind of retaliation would Chris Jericho have for Jon Moxley's um, answer to not joining the Inner Circle last week when Moxley hit Jericho with the champagne bottle, and we got the answer on tonight's episode. So we saw a 4-way tag team match involving um, Hangman Adam Page and Kenny Omega versus the Young Bucks versus Santana and Ortiz versus the Best Friends. Now this one was to determine who was going to get a tag title match or opportunity next week at against SCU. And it was Hangman Page and Kenny Omega picking up the W in that one, defeating the other 3 teams, the Young Bucks, the Best Friends, and Santana and Ortiz. We also we saw a promo for the Dark Order, and their whole thing about wanting to recruit people that have been losing and haven't been getting wins, and they seem to be targeting the elite as people that are associated with that group of Cody, Kenny Omega, Hangman, and the Young Bucks. They showed different videos of people they want to recruit, like Brandon Cutler, Michael Nakazawa. I forget who the other one was. There was somebody else, and maybe even Hangman Page. Them trying to recruit him to join the Dark Order. So that'll be interesting to see what happens with that. We also saw Brandy Rhodes and Mel with Luther and the Nightmare Collective taking on Chris Statlander and Hikaru Shida in a women's tag team match, as it would be Chris Statlander and Hikaru Shida picking up the W in that one. We also heard from Cody and his response to MJF's stipulations for a match between the 2 of them at Revolution. Of course, MJF's stipulations were Cody would have to face Wardlow in a steel cage, which we found out will happen on the February 19th episode of Dynamite in Atlanta. Also, Cody would not be able to touch MJF before Revolution, and that Cody would take 10 lashes on live TV from MJF, and he accepted those. So the matchup will take place at Revolution, Cody versus MJF. And as I mentioned, we found out that it will be Cody versus Wardlow in a steel cage on the February 19th edition of Dynamite when they're in Atlanta. So that was huge there. Speaking of MJF, he was in action. He would team up with the Butcher and the Blade. They took on and were victorious over the team of DDP, Dustin Rhodes, and QT Marshall. So that was another huge matchup there. Then there was also 2 matches to determine the number 1 contender, or who would go on to next week to face off to become the number 1 contender. The first one was Jon Moxley versus the Inner Circle's Sammy Guevara, and Jon Moxley would make Sammy tap out with the rear naked choke, picking up the W in that one. Then he would be attacked by Chris Jericho, Jake Hager, and Santana and Ortiz. They would beat him down, and then Jericho would take a spike off of his jacket and jab it into the eye of Jon Moxley. So there was a question of whether or not Moxley would be able to compete next week, and we got our answer at the end of tonight's episode. Trying to think what other ones were happening. So basically, the main event was Pac versus Darby Allin, and the winner would go on to face Moxley in next week's matchup, number 1 contenders match. Really good match between Darby Allin and Pac. I thought they did a really good job, but in the end, it was Pac picking up the win with the Black Arrow, and thus earning his spot in next week's match for the number 1 contendership. Then when Tony Schiavone was interviewing him, Pac was like gloating that, oh, you saw what happened earlier. Moxley's not going to be able to compete. Then they would show an ambulance backstage where they were trying to get Moxley into the ambulance. They had him in there. They shut the doors, but then Moxley would come out of the ambulance and come to the ramp and basically say that next week he's going to beat Pac and he's going to be in that match next week. So it looks like that match is set for next week on the Jericho Cruise. Jon Moxley versus Pac for the number 1 contendership to the AEW World Title. So that was pretty much it, I believe. I don't know if I'm missing anything. I don't have my notebook in front of me, so I don't remember if that's all there was. But next week looks like it's going to be a good show with Kenny Omega and Hangman Page challenging SCU for the tag titles. Inner Circle versus Jurassic Express. And Pac versus Jon Moxley with the number 1 contendership to the AEW World Title on the line. So that should be an interesting episode next week. So that's pretty much it as far as AEW Dynamite was concerned. I'm pretty sure I don't know if I missed anything. If I did, please let me know in the comments below. But yeah, that was pretty much it. I thought this week's episode, night number 1 of Bash at the Beach, I thought was pretty good. And also, before I forget, apparently on social media is that I should have mentioned this in my news and notes, that apparently Impact Wrestling got a ban on Twitch because of last night's episode of Impact. They had a segment that with RVD, Katie Forbes, and Katie Forbes' girlfriend Jennifer, that apparently Twitch found to be too raunchy and too not explicit, but basically that they found a thing that they found that segment that happened to be in violation of the terms of airing things on Twitch, which I found to be funny because, you know, it was what it was. For those of you that watched Impact last night, um, there wasn't much to the episode. It was basically a highlight episode from matches that were at Hard to Kill, plus other matches that took place. There were like maybe 3 or 4 matches that took place. The rest were like highlights of, or clips of different parts of matches that happened at Hard to Kill this past Sunday. But yeah, apparently Impact Wrestling got a ban on Twitch, so it'll be interesting to see how what's going to happen and how they're going to be able to get unbanned. So, with that being said, this has been my AEW Dynamite recap for this week's episode. As always, I am Brian, and thank you for watching.